Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon.
One communist on the faculty of one university is one communist too many. One communist among the American advisors at Yalta was one communist too many. And even if there were only one communist in the State Department, even if there were only one communist in the State Department, that would still be one communist too many.
Welcome. My guest today is Larry Tye. He is a New York Timesbest-selling author who has written several books on a myriad of topics, including on Bobby Kennedy, Satchel Paige, and the high-flying history of America's most enduring hero, Superman. From 1986 to 2001, he was an award-winning journalist, national writer, and investigative reporter for the Boston Globe. He currently runs the Boston-based Health Coverage Fellowship, which helps the media do a better job of reporting on critical issues like public health, mental health, and high-tech medicine. His research and writings continue, but today we will discuss his recently released book, Demagogue, The Life and Long Shadow of Senator Joe McCarthy. I'd like to say thank you once again and welcome to the nationally recognized journalist and New York Times bestselling author, Larry Tye. Welcome, Larry.
Great to be with you this morning.
Larry, it is tradition here to accompany our conversation with a special brew. Our selection today in honor of Senator Joe McCarthy is Dirty Bastard Scotch-style ale from the Founders Brewing Company of Grand Rapids, Michigan. Founders Brewery says it's so good it's almost wrong. It is complex in finish with hints of smoke and peat, paired with a malty richness and a right hook of hop power to give it the bad attitude that this beer named Dirty Bastard must live up to. If you think you're up to the challenge of this Scotch-style ale, it is available at Hy-Vee Wine and Spirits in Quincy. Remember, you can suggest a feature beer for a future episode. Just subscribe to the History A Go-Go podcast, leave a review. You'll have a chance to win a $10 gift card from Hy-Vee. So please subscribe, like our Facebook page, and leave a comment. Everyone's familiar with the senator, pretty much. And in fact, you've said that every school child in America is introduced to Joe McCarthy, but generally as a caricature. I would say that's absolutely true. He's almost portrayed like as a Batman villain or something like that. So what drew you first to research and then write about a character from our history viewed by many as borderline sinister?
So that's a good question, and I want to take it in two parts. First, why would I be drawn to a character that dark? And the answer is that it was when I was researching my last book, which was a biography of Bobby Kennedy. I interviewed 450 people, and I would say that the only one of them who was truly essential was a woman named Ethel Kennedy, Bobby's widow. And she said something that I could never get out of my head, and that was Joe McCarthy might be a monster to much of America, but to Bobby and to Ethel, he was just plain good fun. And there are a lot of adjectives I associate with Joe McCarthy, but good fun aren't among the ones. And I wondered, was there this other side to Joe McCarthy that America's iconic liberal couple would adore him the way that they did? And so that sort of planted in my head the interest. It was sparked in part or expanded in part by the fact that an old pal who was the official historian of the U.S. Senate was in the process of curating the release of 9,000 pages of transcripts of all the closed-door hearings that McCarthy held. And those were 2/3 of the hearings that McCarthy held were with the press and the public locked out. These hearings, this guy was telling me, revealed again a different take, a McCarthy unhinged sense when nobody was looking. Here's what he was really like. So all of that planted in my mind the idea that this was interesting, but it still seemed like a story of ancient history. And that's the second half of your question. Only the day after the 2016 election, what seemed like a story of our past and one that we had outgrown seemed to me at that moment like a story that was perhaps the key to our present, that to understand what was going on in Washington from 2016 to today, we have to understand the lessons of the archetypal demagogue in American history, Joseph Raymond McCarthy.
So could you give us a little background where he came from? I know he's a Midwest guy. And is there anything in that background that would help form him to create the Joe McCarthy that we would know later?
So the answer again is a nuanced one. It is yes and no. Yes, his background absolutely informed who he became. He was a farm-raised kid. He came with Midwestern heartland kinds of values, and for the rest of his life, he would cherish the notion of what was going on in his native Midwest and among people like the farmers he grew up with. And he idealized them to the extent that that became the basis of his populist appeal. His appeal was every bit as much as a populist and as an anti-elitist as it was an anti-communist. And so understanding where he came from definitely informed who he became. And yet I'm really loath to blame either on his family or on his fellow Midwesterners what Joe McCarthy became. He was ambitious in a way that the only thing that explains it, I think, is some sense of who he was instinctively. He was an opportunist. He was all kinds of things that I think that his family, had they been honest, would never have wanted to claim as their heritage. And certainly people from the farm area in Appleton, Wisconsin that he came from, while some of them would remain loyal to him forever, I think more of them became embarrassed that Appleton became known to the world as the home of the red-baiting Joe McCarthy.
So he did have a background in boxing. In fact, he was a boxing coach, I think, at Marquette. It seems to have formed his ideology in a way on how he dealt with people, because what I've seen from McCarthy in the past is a lot of individuals, and you mentioned Ethel Kennedy, for example, where he could be very combative, but then afterwards he was affable. It was almost strange, and to me, it had to have some tie to his experience as a boxer.
It did. So his boxing became a metaphor for, in many ways, his life. He had been boxing since he was a kid, and his father bought him his first set of boxing gloves. He would at times intimidate his brothers and his neighbors with his boxing. He coached boxing, as you said, in college, but even before that in high school. He made some extra cash and loved teaching kids how to defend themselves. But he also saw life in a way, and certainly his political life, as a boxing match. It was the kind of thing where he would go in and there were almost no rules to the way he fought. He would hit above the belt when that worked. He would hit below the belt when that was the way of getting ahead. He thought that his political tangling with the targets of his investigations was like a boxing match where they would understand that during the day he would go after them like any good boxer would, trying to not just pin them, but to knock them down, and that afterwards you would shake hands and he could invite the targets of his daytime grilling out for an evening beer. It was all a game to him, and if you didn't understand the rules of the game, he felt that was your problem, and he wasn't going to be bothered by that.
So another thing, I was a history student, and when I covered Joe McCarthy in terms of his military service, it was all it was all made up. That's the way it was portrayed. And the truth of his service is a little bit different, you found.
So the truth is different. And in the papers that I saw, his widow left shortly after his death all of his personal and professional papers to his alma mater, Marquette University, and they were under lock and key for 60 years. And for some reason, the family agreed that they would temporarily open them up for me to have an exclusive look at them, and that they're now back under lock and key. And one of the things those records show, while in many ways they show him to be an even more insidious character and a dangerous guy than we thought, in some ways they show him to have been telling the truth at moments we were convinced he was lying. And one of those is in his World War II military service. He went off. He signed up voluntarily. He was a sitting circuit court judge and could have been excused from military duty during World War II because being a judge was considered essential service. He decided, for patriotic reasons and for reasons of future political advancement, that he was going to enlist. He went into the Marines. He ended up in a South Pacific island in a time of relatively heavy fighting with the Japanese. And his official assignment was as a land-based intelligence officer. But when he came back and ran for Senate, he said he took on the moniker Tail Gunner Joe. And he said, I was up there as a tail gunner under enemy fire, fighting for our country. And the press and much of the public said, geez, no, you were a land-based intelligence officer and you're a liar. And all of his embellishing about other things carried over, and people assumed that he must be embellishing his war record. Well, it turns out we now know from his real-time handwritten diary from that South Pacific island and from letters from his squad mates, we now know that, in fact, while he was based officially on the ground in a relatively safe position, he volunteered for duty to go up and fly with his comrades. He often was back there as a tail gunner. He did come under enemy fire, and he, in fact, deserved the dozen medals that he won for his service in the Marines during World War II. So I think the lesson from this is, if you fudge enough, people will doubt you even when you're telling the truth and about something as essential of whether you were a wartime hero or a faker.
Yeah, and that image of him, which is common, of where he's a tail gunner and he's got his whole outfit on and so forth. I know he used that politically later, and he wasn't alone in the politicians who used their service. But let's fast forward a little bit. The end of the war. This is also very common during this time period. Richard Nixon, for example, finished with his service, and JFK, and immediately get into politics. And that's exactly what happens with Joe McCarthy. Can you explain what happens in the campaign against Robert La Follette Jr. and his election to the Senate in 1946?
Yes. So Joe McCarthy starts his political life as not just a Democrat, but as an FDR and New Deal loving liberal Democrat. And that's when he's running for district attorney near where he grew up. He discovers quickly that running for a Democrat, as a Democrat, and certainly as a liberal Democrat in rural Wisconsin, is a non-starter of a political posture to take. So sometime probably in the middle of the night when nobody's looking, he quietly changes his registration to a Republican. And when he's taking on Bob La Follette, a legendary figure in Wisconsin politics, who was the son of another legend, also called Bob La Follette, McCarthy wants to run against him in the Republican primary. And the opening is representing the so-called stalwart or most conservative wing of the Republican Party in Wisconsin. So from liberal Democrat to conservative Republican, not blinking. And he also didn't blink during the campaign when he took on La Follette, partly with legitimate issues, questioning whether La Follette had now become captive to the Washington establishment, which he might have. But he also lied about a lot of things in La Follette's background, suggesting that he was really living in a fancy house outside Washington and that had no legitimate roots in Wisconsin anymore, raising questions about issues that he knew were false questions to be raised. And so he set the template that governed the campaigns that he ran and the politics generally, which was do whatever it took to get ahead. He was ambitious, he was opportunistic, and he was amoral. And all of that came out in pretty stark terms in that first big election and first successful statewide election that he ran for senator way back in 46.
Yeah, and that's not uncommon for some politicians. Ronald Reagan was a New Dealer at one point. The world had changed by the time the war ends, and America's position in the world had changed. And that leads us to this, this idea of McCarthyism just in general. And of course, he didn't start the idea of anti-communism. It had been around even before he was elected, and we can go back to the Bolshevik Revolution and the Red Scare and like the early 1900s. But he does seize on it, and there are some events that he's looking at during the time he's in Washington: the rise of anti-communism, the Alger Hiss with the House Un-American Activities Committee, and then Truman has loyalty boards, and all of these things are setting the stage for somebody like McCarthy to take advantage of. And then there's a famous speech that he gives, and maybe you can describe what happens generally in the Republican Party on the Abraham Lincoln birthday, and these politicians go out to the different locations. You can kind of explain that. But he gives a very famous speech, and that changes his whole trajectory.
It changes his trajectory, and one could argue it changes in many ways the country's trajectory. And that speech was on February 9th, 1950. On Abraham Lincoln's birthday, Republicans across America use it as an opportunity not just to raise their profile and to raise their energy level. They raise a lot of money there. And in various cities around the country, there are big dinners that night. And if you're in a place like Chicago or New York or Washington, you get to have a really prominent senator or maybe a president or a vice president come in and give that big Lincoln Day speech. If you're in a place like Wheeling, West Virginia, you take anybody that you can get. In that year in 1950, the only one they could get was Joe McCarthy, a first-term and looked like only one-term senator, a backbencher from Wisconsin who was notable for basically nothing. And he comes in that night with a big briefcase. And in his briefcase are two speeches. He reaches down and he doesn't pick out the first speech there, which is a snoozer of a speech on national housing policy. And had he delivered that speech that night, you and I wouldn't be here 70 years later talking about Joe McCarthy, because, Rob, nobody would really remember him today. But instead, he reached deeper into that briefcase. He pulls out the second speech, which is a barn burner of a speech. He holds it up in his right hand and he says, I have in my hand here a list of 205 spies at the U.S. State Department. And basically he's saying these are people that President Harry Truman should have known about, should have rooted out, and are making our country less safe. And at that moment in 1950, we were a country that was afraid. We were afraid because we had just watched nationalist China turn into red China. We were afraid because we had watched the atomic spies, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, be captured, be tried, and be sentenced to death. We were about to do something extraordinary, which none of your younger listeners will believe. We were about to implement in every school across America a program called Duck and Cover. And what that meant was, if there was an atomic explosion, all you had to do to keep safe was to duck under your desks and cover your head with your hands, and you'd be okay. That was the kind of fear there was in America. Joe McCarthy saying he had the key to that insecurity, which was State Department riddled with spies, was an appealing message at that moment. Even though he knew he might have had a grocery list in his hand, he might have had a recycled list of people that earlier committees had raised as possible risks for whatever reason. But the names that he ended up naming were many people who weren't still at the State Department, some who had some leftist association somewhere in their family, and nearly none of them were anything close to what we could call the kind of spy that McCarthy was saying they were. And it didn't matter. It didn't matter because within 2 days, he was on page one in every newspaper in America, and he never turned back. McCarthyism, I think, was born that night in Wheeling, West Virginia. The crusade was on, and Joe McCarthy, despite the fact that he was a Johnny-come-lately to this whole cause of the Red Scare, Joe McCarthy is the one whose name we remember. It's not called Trumanism. It's not called Dyeism after Martin Dyes, the head of the House Un-American Activities Committee. It is called McCarthyism because while his charges may not have been real, his sense of drama and of how to put reporters on page one with his bogus claims was very real.
It's the same Communist Party, if you please, that ordered American boys have their hands wired behind their backs and their brains blown out with communist machine guns. It's one and the same party, my good friend.
One of the things I don't think a lot of people realize is during the Great Depression, there was a pretty massive movement towards communist ideology. And it wasn't uncommon for individuals to be drawn to that. They thought the capitalist system had failed them, after years of the Great Depression. So these individuals that maybe in some altruistic way get involved with the Communist Party early on, seeing successes that we weren't seeing in the United States at the time, are going to pay that price later at this time period in the 1950s. But you bring up the press. If he gives that speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, and then he has no one to report it to, we might not have Joe McCarthy either. He kind of needs a partner. He needs a vehicle.
So he needs a vehicle, and he understands the press enough that Wheeling turns out to be the perfect space to give that speech. It's perfect because he knew there would be reporters there, that there would be a reporter from the local newspaper called the Wheeling Intelligencer, that there would be a local Associated Press reporter, there would be a local reporter from the radio station. And that was perfect. That was exactly the kind of reporting corps that he wanted. They were reporters who would report his every word. They would have no clue who to call at the State Department that same night for comment to be in the next day's story. And even if they had known who to call, he gave his speech as a dinner speech, so they would have had no time on their deadline to make that call. It was placed in the perfect place out in the middle of nowhere. And that was where Joe McCarthy liked best to break his news, because these were callow reporters who might know how to report on the local mine operator or the local farm, but not on the State Department and on a senator's charges like this. So he always tried to break his news as far away from the seasoned press corps as he could, and he always played to his understanding of just how the press worked. And when he could, he charmed reporters, and when he couldn't, he badgered them. And if this sounds familiar, it ought to.
Now, TV rises in prominence during his time where McCarthyism is also rising. Does that have an impact when you were looking into it? Does the fact that TVs were getting almost in nearly every household at that point expand his message at all, or am I reading into that a little too far?
No, you're reading into it properly, but TV was his doing and his undoing. It was his doing in that he understood as well as anybody in America just how important this relatively new medium of TV was, and he exploited it. He was there waving his finger and dramatically announcing his newest list of spies on television. He was brilliant at any medium that was out there at the time. He knew how to make use of old-time newspapers, of magazines, of periodicals, of books. He wrote short pamphlets that he turned into actual books, and he knew how to exploit any medium, including the new medium of TV, along with an older medium of radio. And yet, in the end, it was the television set during the famous Army McCarthy hearings that let Americans see what this champion of theirs really seemed like when they watched him night after night. And it was what exposed him, I think, as the bully that he was. But in the early days, TV was among his many media enablers.
One of the other things that I thought was interesting, when I listened to Joe McCarthy, he has a very distinctive way of speaking. Is there anything in his background that would account for his cadence or speaking pattern, maybe his religious background or some speakers he's heard in the past? I don't know if you picked up on that, but it just seems very unique.
Yes, so it is a unique cadence. It's the perfect Midwestern populist cadence. It is slow, it is shrill, it is understanding exactly how to deliver the best punchline and how to overwhelm his opponents when they tried to speak up in that same medium against him. And he was, while in the end, he was in part done in by television with Edward R. Murrow and his shows, he understood that medium really, really well, as Edward R. Murrow and everybody else involved in those early days of TV understood. And again, blaming it on his farm background would be unfair, but saying that it was sort of that plain-spoken manner that comes from the Midwest, that is something that has sold throughout American history, and it sure as heck did in the 1950s with Joe McCarthy.
Traitors are not gentlemen, my good friends. They don't understand being treated like gentlemen. May I say to you, my good friends, tonight, to the American people, that I don't care. I don't give a tinker's dang how high or how low people in either the Republican or Democrat party, either party, are unhappy about our methods. This fight is going to go on as long as I am in the United States Senate.
The other thing that changes his trajectory, in 1952, there's a conservative wave that sweeps through politically in the country. The GOP gains control of the Senate, and that changes his particular position. Can you speak to that?
Sure. He goes from being a true backbencher, where he could say anything he wanted because he wasn't in the majority, he wasn't controlling subcommittees or committees, and when you're out of power, it's sometimes easier to be shriller. But the only thing scarier than a guy like this shouting the chants of fire when there was no fire was when he started shouting them from his position on the podium with a gavel in his hand as chair of the big, important subcommittee, the permanent subcommittee on investigations. And that was actually more important than the committee he chaired. That came about because of the Eisenhower landslide of 1952. And at the beginning of 1953, Joe McCarthy, who had launched his reign of terror back in that February speech in 1950, in the beginning of 1953, he became the powerful chairman who could subpoena witnesses, hold hearings whenever he wanted, and basically make life miserable for all the people that he targeted in the State Department, at the Voice of America, and in the White House.
So leading up to that, how beneficial is McCarthy to that conservative type of landslide in 1952? He gives that famous speech in Wheeling in 1950, and then he must be hammering it the whole time. The party had to benefit from that.
So on the one hand, the party hugely benefited. When he went on and took on a powerful Democrat, like he did in 1950, in the election of November 1950, when he took on Millard Tydings, the very powerful senator from Maryland, who had investigated McCarthy's charges in Wheeling and had declared the whole thing a fraud and a hoax. McCarthy got his revenge by going into Maryland, recruiting a know-nothing Republican candidate, getting financing for the candidate, lending him Joe McCarthy's bag of dirty tricks, and Tydings went down to defeat. And that sent a message to other Democrats and to Republicans. You take on the senator at your own potential peril. McCarthy helped the Republicans gain the majority in the Senate in the 1952 election. And yet it was Eisenhower whose coattails really brought Republicans to power, not just in the White House, but in the Senate. And it was Eisenhower who, while he thought that he needed Joe McCarthy to win Wisconsin and its delegates to get the nomination and then to win the White House, in fact, history suggests that Eisenhower could have taken on McCarthy and beat him and exposed him as the bully that Eisenhower was convinced McCarthy was, that Eisenhower was one of the few people with the power to win office, to have long coattails with or without Joe McCarthy. And I think it's a little bit of a misreading of history or misreading of the politics of the moment that people gave Joe McCarthy a lot more credit than he deserved in terms of his political power. And it's something that I think if Dwight Eisenhower went to his grave with any regrets, it was not taking on Joe McCarthy earlier and more forcefully, the way that Dwight's brother Milton urged him to do from moment one.
Now, part of McCarthyism, just in general, it's lying, and lying to the point where if you tell a lie, let's say a reporter has to spend time actually running that down and finding the veracity of it before they can disprove it. He's told 5 or 6 lies within the time that they've even dealt with that. Bullying, aggressiveness, never accepting defeat, even when it's right in your face, or never accepting fault when it's obvious to all that you are at fault. How do figures in history that have these attributes somehow, because they seem so vile, but for some reason they have political traction?
So they do have political traction, and they have political traction because when we're in a time of fear, whether it is in 1950 or in 2016, Americans are fearing legitimate things, whether it was the fear of communism or the fear of economic dislocation more recently. The fears are legitimate. The solutions are not, and they tend to be finger-pointing, but they're compelling, at least initially. They're compelling because they offer a simple solution to what we're afraid of. It's very easy to, if you're afraid of the Soviet Union, to imagine Soviet spies in our own State Department or White House. That gives you an easy solution, something to grab onto, something to go along with that Joe McCarthy is telling you will make things better. And we, as people all over the world, find it incredibly tempting to buy into simple solutions. And that is what let demagogues come to power in America in 1950 in the person of Joe McCarthy. It's what gave the world everybody from Adolf Hitler to Mussolini, from the leaders today of the Philippines and Brazil. And I would argue that it also explains a whole lot of what happened in 2016 in America, that our love affair with bullies has been there from the very beginning. It continues today. And the reason I wrote a book on Joe McCarthy, and the reason I call that book Demagogue rather than McCarthy, is because I think there's nobody in the long history of bullies in America who is a better archetype and somebody that we can more easily learn useful lessons from than Joseph R. McCarthy, who did it with a flourish that few have achieved.
So when's the first time that the term McCarthyism is first used? Is that after he has passed away and later in the 50s or something? When's the first time that's encountered?
So it was early in his career after that 1950 speech. And there are all kinds of stories about who was the first one to utter the word McCarthyism, but it was definitely during his lifetime and during the early part of his crusade, because he embraced the term. He said McCarthyism is Americanism with its sleeves rolled up. He was the best Spinmeister of anybody of that era. And I wrote an earlier book called The Father of Spin, on the man who founded the profession of public relations. And I think if Edward L. Bernays was the father of spin, Joe McCarthy was the son of spin. He knew how to take anything and turn it to his benefit. And he was a brilliant name caller. He called Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, Red Dean. He called.
So he had nicknames. He actually
had nicknames.
Wow.
He had slanderous nicknames for people. He called the only woman in the U.S. Senate who, along with 6 Republican moderates, took on Joe McCarthy early on. This was a woman named Margaret Chase Smith. He called Smith and her 6 Republican colleagues Snow White and the 6 Dwarfs. He was brilliant at penning things that were supposed to be embarrassing, that the public loved, that the press ate up and reprinted. And he was really good at all of this stuff. And that is one of the things, he's the kind of guy, if I could have gone out for a beer with him, it would have been an extraordinary joy. I would have loved to have talked to him because he was a charming, charismatic figure, as Ethel Kennedy acknowledged, even as he was an evil and vile character who ruined lots of people's lives and changed in many ways the course of American history during the Red Scare.
You mentioned his position on the committee and the subcommittee, and the value to that is he now has subpoena power, which he can threaten people with that. But I'm interested in the team that he builds because it has a connection to today. And one of the individuals on that team is Roy Cohn. Could you explain who Roy Cohn is and his position with McCarthy on those committees?
So Roy Cohn was a brilliant and arrogant young lawyer from New York who had a track record of prosecuting and convicting communists. And in 1953, when McCarthy gets that gavel and gets that subpoena power, he needs somebody to run his subcommittee at the staff level. He considers Bobby Kennedy, who he ends up hiring for the number 2 job, and he ends up bringing in Roy Cohn to be Bobby's boss and to run the subcommittee. And Roy Cohn reinforces every bad instinct in Joe McCarthy.
One thing we have to understand at the outset is that the Communist Party is not a political party. It's a criminal conspiracy. Its object is, as has been established by the verdict of a jury, the overthrow of the government of the United States by force and violence as soon as the right time arrives. In the meantime, plans are being made. That day comes, and the Communist Party's most important work is that of espionage in behalf of the Soviet Union, which means that it infiltrates our government, defense plans, every important place possible in order to steal information from us and give it to the Soviet Union.
Roy Cohn is at his side as a sneering presence at the hearings. He's at his side when McCarthy gets into trouble by taking on the Army and defending the special treatment that he has sought for Roy Cohn's young associate, a guy named G. David Schein. Roy Cohn helps take Joe McCarthy up the mountain, as Bobby Kennedy would say, and sends him down in a toboggan with no brakes. And it was an incredible ride on the way down, but it ended up crashing and ending up destroying Joe McCarthy. And I think that Roy Cohn is an interesting character because he doesn't go away when Joe McCarthy does. Roy Cohn resurfaces in our public life in the 1980s after he's no longer a young lawyer by then, and 30 years after he learned things at Joe McCarthy's knee, he teaches those same lessons to a young real estate developer in New York named Donald Trump. Fred Trump and Donald Trump realized that when Donald is entering this cutthroat world of New York real estate, that he needs a tutor, and who better to tutor him than the ultimate hardball player of New York politics and of American politics, Roy Marcus Cohn. So McCarthy's protege becomes Trump's tutor. And when Donald Trump in the White House has gotten into trouble with anything, he's perpetually saying, I sure wish I had Roy Cohn by my side to be telling me what to do. And I think what he's really saying, only it wouldn't be politically correct to say this, is not that he wants his mentor by his side, but that he wants his mentor's mentor, Joe McCarthy, there, because all the real lessons that Roy Cohn was passing on to Donald Trump were ones that he had learned from McCarthy.
So he has to have enablers. And we see this case, we can blame it all. It happens throughout history. When we look back at the Nazis, we just blame it all on Hitler. But the reality is there's a lot more. It's more complex than that. And there's a lot more people that enabled him. And McCarthy would have had to have enablers as well. You mentioned Eisenhower kind of being not forceful in his response to some of the things that McCarthy had done. But how much does the party itself bear responsibility for Joseph McCarthy?
So I think that the huge responsibility is borne by every politician in America. The Democrats said it's up to the Republicans to take him down. We've suffered too many losses when we've tried. The Republicans in the Senate said he's too valuable to us. We have too thin a majority to risk going after one of our own, and he might turn on us. Dwight Eisenhower said we should wait for the bully to fall on his own sword, and that ended up happening. But in the year and a half that it took for it to happen while Eisenhower was in office, lives were ruined, careers were smashed. McCarthy did a lot of damage. So I think there is blame to go around. Another set of enablers were the Texas oil men, who were the biggest underwriters, financial underwriters of what McCarthy was doing. He was so valuable to them that the press in Texas used to call McCarthy the third senator from Texas. But the ultimate enablers were you and I. It is the public that allowed Joe McCarthy to happen. It was the voters in Wisconsin who elected him and reelected him overwhelmingly. It was the American public that told George Gallup and his pollsters at the beginning of 1954 that 50% of them said that Joe McCarthy was doing a great job. He was the second most popular public figure in America, trailing only our war hero, President Dwight Eisenhower.
The one thing about it that's overlooked, I think, and I'm just going to touch on this briefly, is the fact that there are business leaders that benefited from the fact he's willing to lie and say anything. I think Pepsi was one, and you mentioned the oil men. So that's an element to it as well. It's not just the anti-communism. He'll use his same methods to further his political agenda in other areas too. But let's go to the most sinister part of McCarthy, things that are lost to history. Can you give us some examples of what happened to some of these individuals who were accused? Because we focus on McCarthy, but we leave out the victims.
Sure. So I want to focus on one victim that I think was emblematic of all of his victims. I could point to nearly a dozen people who took their own lives because of what sure seemed to their relatives and to everybody around them was a connection to Joe McCarthy. And there's one of them that I want to zero in on, and he was a guy named Ray Kaplan, a mid-level engineer at the Voice of America. The Voice of America was being targeted by Joe McCarthy. McCarthy said that Kaplan and other engineers there had intentionally cited the radio towers that were supposed to be broadcasting our pro-capitalist message to the other side of the Iron Curtain. And McCarthy said they had cited those radio towers in a place where they were not going to have the reach that they should have had to reach, and that this was an attempt at sabotaging our propaganda war with the Russians. Kaplan was about to be called before McCarthy's committee. Kaplan rushes off to MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to talk to the engineers who had helped pick the sites for those radio towers and to make sure they were going to back him up. He couldn't find them. When he leaves campus, there's a truck pulling along on the main street, Massachusetts Avenue, in front of the MIT campus, and Kaplan runs in front of the truck and is crushed and killed. Afterwards, they find a suicide note where he said basically to his wife and young son that he had never done anything wrong, but he just couldn't take this pressure. We fast forward to today, and I'm writing the book, and all the evidence seems to point to Joe McCarthy having been responsible in many ways for Ray Kaplan being so afraid that he took his own life. But I wasn't convinced, and I didn't want to accuse McCarthy of that unless I could be sure. So I tracked down a guy named George Jacobs, who was Kaplan's supervisor when he was at the Voice of America. And this is the one line that I most remember from what Jacobs told me. He said that while it's complicated when anybody takes their own life, he said, if there had been no Joe McCarthy, we would have still Ray Kaplan. He was willing to make that connection in a way that person after person I interviewed was willing to do it with others who committed suicide in the face of Joe McCarthy's badgering. It was those people, it was the people whose careers were smashed, and it was millions of Americans who I think were afraid to ever say, I'm a socialist, I'm a communist, I'm a liberal, because they knew the kind of heat they could take in a superheated era, not just in the 1950s, but even today, where many politicians will, rather than responding to somebody's arguments, they'll simply brand somebody as socialist, and that's supposed to end the argument. That's supposed to mean you're beyond the pale.
You know, the other interesting thing about it, and I guess it's the nature of being a bully, but the State Department you had mentioned, that had been a target for a long time. There's very liberal people in it. I just recently, when I was in Saudi Arabia, worked with the State Department for the Army, and there's a difference. The Department of Defense is a little more conservative than the State Department. So that was a target, and that's understandable. But it seems like in his career, he's picking on these people who are low level, who are basically doing, lower level positions and jobs, and it's an easy target. So it's like the Voice of America and the printing office. It's not going after the Army right away. He's going after these low level institutions and so forth that he can get some traction on without getting a lot of pushback. Am I right about that?
So you are right, and he was strategic, and he started out going after easy targets. Nobody really cared about the State Department. They looked like a bunch of elitists, and they were an easy pickings early on. Nobody even knew really what the Voice of America or the government printing office were. But then he worked his way up. He took on the White House, and he took on arguably the most mighty of all American institutions, the U.S. Armed Services. And that proved to be an institution that was too big to bully.
We were spending an awful lot of time, a lot of money, investigating things other than the communists that we should be digging out of government. Sooner or later, it may take some time, we're being stalled now, sooner or later, we will get the names of those in the Pentagon, the civilian politicians who have been there for the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years, who have been trying to cover up and who have been getting so frantic when they see we're getting near them.
And had he been willing to stop short of that and go after only easy pickings, he might have lasted a lot longer politically and even not have drunk himself to death the way he did. But instead, he went after the military, and he blinked before they did, and they brought him down.
So I'm going to bring up the Winona transcripts. And some conservatives now say that the activities of the House Un-American or the House Un-American Activities Committee were vindicated because, and Alger Hiss, for example, it kind of points to his, guilt in that situation. Is there any use of just to give him an opportunity here to say that maybe some of the things that he said was actually correct with the Winona transcripts and other research that has proven there had been communist activity in the government?
So there was communist activity in the government, and Winona shows that in very clear and stark terms. Winona was a decoding of real-time cables from the Soviets in Washington to the Soviets in Moscow, and we were keeping tabs on this stuff. It was very hush-hush at the time because we didn't want them to know that we were decoding their cables. And I went to the people who I thought were the Winona experts in America and asked them, what about the comparison between McCarthy's lists and the lists that Winona give us? And what they said is there are a handful of names on the McCarthy list that in fact did turn up in Winona, but most of them were people we already knew about, that McCarthy was not key to uncovering any 24-karat spies, that those were people who had been exposed before he came along. Those were people that Joe McCarthy might claim credit for, but not legitimately. And the consensus, I want to actually answer the question in a partly serious way and in a partly fun way. The fun way is that there were jokes told at the time that I think were more than a bit of truth, that Joe McCarthy could have been dropped into the middle of Red Square on May Day and not been able to pick out a real communist. More seriously, I think that it can be said that the anti-communist movement in America was real and had legitimacy, and that Joe McCarthy probably did more damage to the anti-communist movement than he did to the communist movement during his time in office.
So let's finish up today with the thing that brings him down. And you referenced it, but can you talk about how he goes after the United States Army? And that's important because the executive at the time, the commander-in-chief, had spent his entire career in the Army. So can you explain how that develops and then it leads to his demise?
Sure. So what happens is he charges that an Army base in Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, the very vital command and control center for all of the military, all of the American military, he charges that that base is riddled with communist spies. And he holds hearings on that. And at some point, that gets mixed up with the fact that he's also seeking special treatment for Roy Cohn's sidekick, the guy we mentioned earlier, G. David Schein. And it's unclear where McCarthy's concerns about communists at Fort Monmouth begin and where his concerns about protecting Schein and giving him easy duty end. But it all gets so tangled that the Senate finally says, we are going to hold a set of hearings, the famous Army McCarthy hearings, to get to the bottom of this. Is McCarthy telling the truth? Is the Army telling the truth? Is it somewhere in between? At the beginning of those hearings, McCarthy, as we mentioned earlier, is at a full 50% of popularity. By the end of those hearings, his popularity has plummeted to 34% because America has watched day after day as McCarthy appears on their TV screen and they see that this is not the great hero that they had envisioned at the start, that this is a guy who looks more like the town bully.
Senator, may we not drop this? Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
He's basically exposed as what he was, which is a finger pointer who was taking on the Army partly for the benefit of his own staffer, and that his charges couldn't be substantiated. And by the end of those hearings, his position had been weakened not only with the American public, but with his fellow senators, to the point where by the end of 1954, they censured him, an incredibly rare step that had only been done 6 times before in American history. And by the end of that year, 1954, McCarthy's political life was over. He would live for another 2+ years, but he would be so taken down and so humiliated that a drinking problem that he had always had would turn into serious alcoholism. And based on the medical records that were released to me by the Bethesda Naval Hospital, we can say that Joe McCarthy absolutely drank himself to death because of that Senate censure and the humiliation that the destruction of his political career had cost him.
Can you see his alcoholism affecting him in any way? Because when he speaks generally, he seems very lucid in the clips that I've seen him speak. But when in your research, can you see that throughout his time, how he's it's affecting him and his work?
So while it's a written transcript, I think I can see it in the transcripts of his closed-door hearings, that in the morning his questions suggested his state of mind, which was a sober one. And in the afternoon, after he had had his standard lunch of a hamburger, a raw onion, and whiskey, that his questions became more outlandish, his fuse became shorter, and you didn't want to tangle with Joe McCarthy late in the day. And I think that was because of his drinking, and I think we can see it in his behavior. We can see it in the testimony of everybody who was close to him, including his best friend and his wife. And it was clear that over time, it started affecting his behavior more and more. And when I look back at those medical records, which document his drinking, I think that we can see a parallel between his political outrageous behavior being enabled by his lubricating himself at lunch, at dinner, whenever.
And finally, what is the impact that he has today? It seems like it reverberates down through the years.
So it does reverberate. Donald Trump is absolutely the son of Joe McCarthy, with the human through line, the flesh and blood through line being Roy Cohn. But more importantly, beyond Donald Trump or beyond anybody's partisan politics, I think that my book, which is about the most malevolent figure in recent American history, is in fact a good news story. And the good news story is, given sufficient rope, every demagogue in the long history of America, including most notably Joe McCarthy, given enough rope, they hang themselves, and given enough time, the American people see through this bullying and we rediscover our better nature.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. I'm really interested in your Superman book, so maybe you could come back and speak about Superman.
Great. So someday I'd love to do that.
I'd like to thank our guest today, New York Times best-selling author Larry Tye. If you would like to get Larry's book, Demagogue, you can go to LarryTye.com. That is LarryTye.com. There's a lot of great information about all of his work right there on that site at LarryTye.com. The featured beer was Dirty Bastard Scotch-style Ale from the Founders Brewing Company in Grand Rapids, Michigan. You can find that and other selection from Founders at Hy-Vee Wine and Spirits. The music was provided by the band Bones Fork, which has a new album coming out really soon. Their other music is available on iTunes, Spotify, and other places music is purchased online. Remember to subscribe to the podcast and like our Facebook page. Leave a review for your chance to win a gift card. And join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.
Often operating as a one-man committee, he has traveled far, interviewed many, terrorized some. Accused civilian and military leaders of the past administration of a great conspiracy to turn over the country to communism.
Question is, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I'm framing my answer in the only way in which any American citizen has stood up for Americanism for many years, and I
stand away from the stand.